Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Grounded Life podcast. Today, I'm speaking to an amazing lady called Gwen Payne. Now, Gwen is the founder of Inspired Sedona and is talking to us from Sedona in Arizona today. Gwen has been a facilitator for over 20 years. She uses a combination of breathwork, of family constellations, of hypnotherapy, something called the passion test, yoga, and dance to guide and support people in coming home to their true nature and to remain consciously connected to their true nature. In the last few years, though, Gwen has discovered a new passion for herself, and this has delved into the world of intimacy coaching, which we're predominantly going to be talking about today, this subject of intimacy and pleasure. So, hi, Gwen, welcome. How are you
Hi,
doing?
Hannah. I'm good. Thank you. I'm excited to be here with you. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
So before we sort of dive into this conversation, is there anything else that you wanted to add to your introduction? Anything more that you want people to know about you before you begin?
Just I guess that I'm also the founder of Breath is Prayer. So that is my style of breath work that I both facilitate and train people to do. So that's the only piece I would love to add.
Thank you. Yes, and I'll put all the links actually to find you at the end of this podcast in the description, so people can find you and all your offerings. But first of all, let us talk. Let us talk about these things. So intimacy and pleasure. These are two words that are coming up in our conversation today. Now, awkwardly, but honestly, I really notice a part of me that has this kind of immediate reaction to these words: intimacy, pleasure, and like this immediate, it's actually only part of me that has this reaction, like it's something sexual or kinky. And that response I'm really noticing is so immediate that it doesn't even really feel like it's mine, but it's actually like a form of conditioning, that these are like buzzwords that have predominantly been used by mainstream avenues that mean a certain thing. And so my first sort of question is, am I alone in this conditioning?
Oh my gosh, absolutely not. And in fact, I think that this is why the field of sexuality, intimacy coaching is really exploding because it has been such a taboo conversation, right? I mean, if you think about it, we're all here because two people had sex, yeah? And yet, most people, when I'm talking to them, will tell me that they never had sex conversations in their family. I mean, that depends. Some countries are more open than others, but certainly here in the US, at least 9 out of 10 people will tell me, because I do ask people a lot of questions about their upbringing, the attitudes in their family, or maybe the religion they were brought up in, or in general. That's one of the primary places we start when I'm working with couples or individuals is, what might you have taken on consciously or unconsciously in your attitudes towards your body, towards gender and sexuality, towards pleasure, for example. And so, with regard to intimacy, I just want to kind of clear up what I mean by intimacy, because it's
Yeah.
true that for a lot of people, their mind immediately goes to sexual intimacy. But I call it, for example, my sessions are called inspired intimacy.
Mm,
And intimacy to me is connection. So, yes, a lot of people are looking for support, around their erotic expression or their sexual connection if they're in a partnership. But we're going to look at where that energy is stuck. Is it stuck in their emotional connection? Because that's going to free up their sexual connection. So we look at it in a lot of different ways, but it is at the end of the day all about connection, and all roads lead to intimacy in the way that I support people. So that's in part what I love about the things that I already do with the breath work. That can be another avenue that we might use. We might use the passion test. I can't tell you honestly how surprised I am when I work with couples that doing the passion test, which just simply reveals what we're most passionate about in the moment. right? And again, passion is another word that's often equated with sexuality, but this just
Yeah,
means
absolutely.
what lights us up within ourselves. How couples who've been together for years get awkward around each other talking about what really is important to them, what they value, right? So that's again um, an example of intimacy. And then with pleasure, I mean, we are born to experience pleasure. What I mean by that is that, every cell in our body has a pleasure receptor. And you can see this with babies and with toddlers really, seeking pleasure, whether it's through, touch or sound or taste or, so on and so forth. So we're born with that. I want to almost say need, right? But yet in our culture, for the most part, we learn to starve ourselves of pleasure. And so it's not certainly not limited to sexuality. And in fact, what I coach people is the more that we can give our bodies pleasure, and that could just be finding a soft blanket to wrap ourselves in, on a cold night, or lighting a particular candle. So really involving our senses, but learning to feed ourselves pleasure so that we're filled up, so that when we come together to have a sexual encounter with somebody, that we're sharing that erotic energy, that pleasure, right, as opposed to feeling starved and then needing to get pleasure from somebody else. So I hope I answered your
Mm.
questions.
Yeah, there's so many things within that, there's so many avenues one could go down. So, pleasure isn't this luxury. Like we're born into the world with, yeah, I love what you said, that each, there's a pleasure receptor in every cell in our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you use the word luxury, because that's inherently how most people feel. Now, when I say inherently, it's due to conditioning. So it's not innate really, but it due to the heavy conditioning, and especially more for men, but not certainly not limited to men. So, one of the things I ask people right out of the gate is, what percentage of your day do you devote towards feeding yourself some pleasure? Right. And I'm not expecting a huge percentage, but I'll tell you, it's so low. It's 0% sometimes. It's, 2%, 5%, right? And I'm not suggesting that we just, loll on the couch and feed ourselves, have somebody feed us, skinned grapes or something like that. I mean, great if you've got the time
Sounds
and the
nice.
if you've got the inclination, but just throughout the day to check in. Maybe it's a moment where we just really allow the warm water on our back in the shower. We just take that in. We soak it in literally and metaphorically, right? Or maybe it's stepping outside for a moment and just breathing in fresh air, right? And feeling the sun on our face, or stopping for a moment and listening to the birds, or, of course, the ubiquitous stop and smell the roses, right? So
Mm.
just in
Yeah,
small ways.
it's nice and very interesting, because what you're saying is kind of, and it for me, then I just made the link to mindfulness, because when you're being more mindful, you're more mindful of how you're feeling, and you're kind of maybe more sensory, or kind of more with the felt sense work. So it's not about going to seek pleasure. It's actually about recognizing and feeling the pleasure in kind of your day to day, the things that are already here and that you're already doing, a lot of it maybe. And then, as you're saying, even like having your daily shower, like we do that every day. But what if it could be pleasurable? How different a dynamic of the start of your day would be.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's kind of a combination between mindfulness and sensuality, if you will, because of course what I'm describing is sensuality. And again, sensuality is, so often just linked with sexuality, but sensuality is its own entity, right? So it is really dropping into the senses. And I love that, you incorporated this idea of mindfulness. And so a lot of times my experience here of people who are into mindfulness, they're being more mindful of their thoughts perhaps than they are of
Mm.
their bodies. So, and that's just been my experience, but I'm sure there are plenty of
I
people that
guess
are
like
practicing.
mindful mind.
Yeah.
It kind of like has it in the title, doesn't it? But definitely bring it into the more embodied, yeah, the more
Yes.
embodiment of the practice.
Yes, embodied mindfulness. That's beautiful. I think you just coined something.
Going to patent that one. I'm sure it might
Yeah.
already be a thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me, yeah, tell me also what I'm quite interested in is how you came to this, because you've been a facilitator for 20 years. So after so many years, why the shift into intimacy coaching?
Um, well, I think that, it's interesting because the thread goes way, way back, if you will, in terms, when I look back, I now see that my whole life I've really been studying relationship. I just didn't realize it. Um, and what I mean by that is that I've always just been fascinated by the complexities of relationship. And in my breath work, there is a sensual component that I've really explored in terms of also coaching people is to drop into the sensual experience of breathing, not just like, oh, we're doing this to release or drop in, but really to explore that's one of the fastest ways of dropping in. um, and so there's that piece. There's also this relational aspect where my whole life I've just been kind of investigating my own relationships, through my deep personal work. Like I said, books that I read, films that I watch, it's always about relationship. And so the facilitation that I've been doing for so many years has been about my relationship to myself, how that has helped me to live more authentically. And that's really what I've been sharing with people. And so, I've been facilitating that, and then I was introduced in a way to somebody mentioned that they were an erotic blueprints coach, and so I was just stunned. I can't tell you why I was stunned, but I just like the name, and I just was something got electrified within me to where I was suddenly just speechless and wanted to know more. What is that? I mean, and so it was, if you will, divine timing, because something sparked in me. And when she shared with me, this erotic blueprints coach, had what she was doing, the work that she was doing with people, then I raced home and wanted to, I mean, she basically just covered the topic very briefly, but I raced home and
And can
just,
you give us a quick synopsis of like what
yeah.
is the
So, erotic blueprints are Jaya's version. She's the founder of the erotic blueprints, and she was a sexologist, or still is a sexologist. And after 20 years, what she discovered was essentially like the love languages in our erotic expression. And so, what that means is that we all have a primary blueprint, but we're a composite of these five different blueprints. And so one is energetic, one is sensual, one is sexual, one is kinky, and one's a shapeshifter. And those are just the names. It's kind of like if you are familiar with the love languages, we, might have the love language of touch, of, acts of service, quality time, gifts, and words of affirmation. And the whole point of these systems of kind of typing is it helps us to learn more about ourselves, so that in part we can share what we've learned about ourselves with the other people in our life, right? So that we can receive the kind of love language, or receive the kind of turn on in terms of our erotic expression from others, and so that we can understand others better and not take how they show up personally. Right. So that's kind of really it in a nutshell. It builds a bridge of understanding and compassion between people when we know each other's typing and can speak to that. And then with the blueprints, you can also heal within our own blueprint and expand into the others. So it really gives us like a lifetime of possibilities of expansion in terms of our erotic expression. So does that give you a bit of a window, Hannah?
Yeah, I love it. I actually think the last time that you explained it to me, you were also saying in a partnership, maybe they don't know maybe they're trying to communicate in intimacy, but it's kind of like, two ships passing in the night. And then actually, once you identify more about the way in which you want to give or receive, or the maybe your language, then you're more able to kind of communicate with your close network about actually how to give and receive love, intimacy, affection, compassion, and build, I guess, healthier, more intimate relationships.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's just like what you said. Essentially, one person is speaking French and the other person is speaking German, right? So there's this disconnect, or there eventually there can be a disconnect. And interestingly enough, when people often first come together, they just kind of come into one blueprint, but then as they settle into relationship, they kind of revert back to what they were before, and then they just wonder why um, intimacy is more challenging, for example, to them. And bottom line is, it just opens up a lot of opportunity for conversation, because a lot of people in relationship are not having conversations about their own erotic expression, in part because they don't necessarily understand it for themselves, but also to, again, the concept of intimacy is just to share and learn about each other, and even themselves, right? So,
Yeah.
kind of to go back to where I was, then I went home and researched it, and learned just a minimal amount and jumped right into a coach training. And so that's what I did a few years ago, is I did the Erotic Blueprints coach training, and now I'm just finishing up with Somatica Institute, a sex and relationship coach training. And it's opened up a whole new world for me that at the same time feels so in line with what I've been kind of unconsciously or subconsciously studying within my own personal life. And, wherever I've been able to witness it in other people's lives as well. So I am just thrilled, 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 thrilled.
Okay, well, let's like funnel back down to
Yes.
our kind of words of intimacy, pleasure, and this work that you're doing at the moment with people. I don't know if you predominantly work with individuals or couples or families, but how do you invite or lead people into putting pleasure as more of a priority in their life, and why is it an important part of your work to do that?
Well, it's both pleasure and play, because honestly, if you think about how much percentage of your day, or, for the listeners as well, if they think about how much, what's the percentage of play and pleasure, a lot of, when I ask my clients, they look at me blankly, first off, because, again, these are considered luxuries, right, for most people. And most people's lives are really about obligation and work and so on and so forth. And a lot of people that I talk to feel like they're just going through the motions, right, in life, in their relationship, and so on and so forth. So, one of the first things that we start to talk about, again, whether I'm working with an individual or I'm working with couples, is the fact that I'm encouraging them to start to explore, right? Because people are often locked into their comfort zones and routines, right? And um, it's interesting because people look for security by getting into relationship with each other, but that security is actually an erotic killer, right? So at the beginning of a relationship, when things are, fresh, that's often what people think, is that they're fresh, but what actually is kind of the fuel for a lot of erotic energy is the fact that it's uncertain. People don't know if they're going to be staying with this person, if this person likes them, and so on and so forth. And so that actually creates a lot of erotic energy. It's fuel for it. But then, of course, people want to feel the stability and security that is lovely in its own way of being in relationship, right? And yet that kind of starts to put a dampening, it starts to have a dampening effect on erotic energy. And so the first thing we want to do, but again, this can be just as applicable for individuals, is start to create opportunities to explore, right? So whether those are opportunities to explore our bodies in different ways, or having fun together, if it's for couples, in new ways, um, that is really the foundation. So it's all about exploration, knowing that, and pleasure as well. So, I tell people when we explore, we don't know if it's going to be a win, right? But the bottom line is that we're trying something new. And it does create a sense of freshness and aliveness. And so one of the things that I'm recommending for couples is that they have some time together each week, and that um, this becomes a commitment that is indelible, right? In terms of the commitment to their relationship, where they're exploring something new each week together. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be even just a conversation, right? So I do actually give people a lot of homework. I give them opportunities to touch, in different ways, to have conversations in different ways, and to try new things together. But I would say really this is so big and it's so simple at the same time, right?
So there is the ability to feel secure and kind of stable in a relationship and still have the balance of play and adventure and that freshness that you mentioned. A balance is possible.
Yeah, and that it becomes the glue. So I experienced this myself in relationship, where we set aside every Tuesday some time um to do exactly what I'm talking about. And during the week, it would happen that we'd get busy, and we'd be pulled in different directions, and sometimes we could even feel a little disconnected, or maybe even that we'd had something come up, an issue come up during the week. And this time together is not the time necessarily to work through it. It's the time to play, if you will. And everybody's definition of play is different. So finding some common ground where we can play, um, uh, it just was like honestly like a honeymoon every single week. It was like at first it was hard to try to remember, and it would be always seem like, oh, but there's a different pull to do something else, oh, but there's a meeting, then I could attend a meeting, or there's a lovely dinner with friends that might have come up. But we really learned to just make that commitment. And so after a while, realizing how powerful this commitment was made it really easy to just say no to everything else, and just dive into that time together.
Yeah, so that word priority came up again, which was kind of in the question. How do you make people prioritize their pleasure more? And I feel like it's a lot of well-being stuff is similar. It's like, how do you invite and kind of like create that value and priority in someone? And again, that's coming back to the conditioning of like, yeah, pleasure, like I don't have time for that. I've got responsibilities, I've got work ethics, and just really reframing, I guess, how we were conditioned again is coming back into it. So yeah.
Conditioning runs deep, doesn't it? And it comes in a lot of different directions. It comes from a lot of different directions, from our families, the imprinting of what we saw with, the people in our family, how they were living, and so on and so forth. So, and also the culture. I mean, what are we taught to prioritize? We're taught to prioritize getting ahead and success, and, or even just working, right? And so a lot of emotions can come up around it, right? How, like, we might feel anxious about prioritizing ourselves or our relationship, right? Or we might feel um, guilty, and so on and so forth. So recognizing that when we feel emotional, when we're breaking conditioning, that emotions are showing us, indicating that perhaps there's some unconscious belief there, like, oh, it's selfish to take care of myself, right? That's one that I often come across with clients. But the interesting thing is that, with regard to relationships, right? One of the things that I tell people is that, a lot of us get into relationships, right? And then if we end up breaking up, right? Which a lot of us do. I mean, most relationships don't last a lifetime. There's a sense of failure for a lot of us. Maybe not always, but there can be. And one of the things that I say is that, first of all, most of us have seen really thriving relationships. So we don't have role models for the most part, right? So this is kind of cutting edge to want that, essentially. And then we haven't been taught to prioritize our relationships, right? So
Mm.
we're prioritizing work, probably, at least number one, or tied with families, right? And neither one of them are incorporating pleasure for ourselves. And marriage or relationship, committed relationship, is just somehow supposed to happen on its own without us really having any idea. So we're stumbling around in the dark, right? And we're not taught to prioritize relationships. So, on the one hand, this time together as glue, where we have play, right, which is a form of pleasure. But on the other hand, prioritizing some level of self care, which again, can be pleasure, because then we're showing up in a nourished way in the relationship. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does, and it ties into so much. Again, I know I keep going back to a more general sense of like well-being and the breath work and everything like this, but it really all ties in. It's actually feels like it's not like this separate thing. It all links into each other. And so, for anyone listening to this, how might they know or have indications if it isn't kind of like, oh my God, get me to Gwen now. How might they know if they're a person that could benefit from exploring more of their creativity and pleasure?
Well, for one, if they're listening to this and something's lighting up in them, like it did with me when that woman spoke to me about the erotic blueprint, coaching, because, you're absolutely right, Hannah. This is all tied together. And when you were saying you started to learn to prioritize well-being, to me, you were starting to learn to prioritize yourself, right? That's first and foremost. That's it, even more so than just the food or this or that. And so when I got lit up by this idea of erotic blueprints, really what was happening for me was that I was realizing, here I was coaching people, and also myself, essentially, to live more authentically, and yet I was not talking at all to people about their erotic expression, right, which is just simply life force. And it just hit me like a thunderbolt, like, how can I be coaching people and living more holistically when I'm not incorporating life force energy as a part of this? And that's really what got me involved. So at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. This is all tied together. And so if something just, if an energy got lit up in you by listening to this conversation, then, reach out and just schedule a discovery call, and we can just chat a little bit more about it and just see which aspect, I kind of tease apart. Because with some people, it is going to be more about bringing them into the breath work. And for some people, it is maybe diving deep into the sexuality work, or just incorporating more pleasure into their lives. So I just always say, follow the energy. Follow the energy. Now, you have to kind of be in your body more than your mind to be able to sense where there is energy rising up for you. So I'd say, if anything, just sparked an interest mentally, but also, just inviting people to start to really pay attention to what where do they feel energy? What does that even feel like in my body? Did I feel kind of excited? Did I feel nervous? Did I feel an opening in my heart? So on and so forth. So following the energy would be the lead in, is what I would say.
Mm,
And it's
that
actually my guidance in life, because, with the passion test, one of the things that I've learned is that we don't and can't really see the big picture. And rather than think, oh, well, I can only follow the energy if I know where that's going to take me. Is that going to take me into a new career? I had no idea where the erotic blueprints coach training was going to take me. Really didn't. I just signed up for it, primarily for myself, right?
mm,
But so to honor that awakening of something in us, whether it's curiosity, awe, wonder, passion, and to know that, fear is often an indicator that something is bring wants to pull us out of our comfort zone, right? And so, there's that saying, the difference between anxiety and excitement is just simply the breath. So if we breathe into fear and really expand into that energy, sometimes really can feel like this mingling of anxiety and excitement.
Mm, lovely. I have two more questions for you, and they
Yeah.
so interlink with everything that you were just saying, which feels so good. So, and I don't know which one to ask first because they are both really relevant.
Follow the energy.
Follow the energy, exactly. Okay, so, well, okay, then this one. So, the energy of pleasure, sensuality, of sexuality, and how this is tied to our creative energy. And you also mentioned life force. I'd love you to talk a bit more into this relationship that these words, kind of pleasure, sensuality, sexuality, is actually part of a creative energy, our creative energy, which
Mm.
ties into our life force. But first of all, what does life force even mean to you?
When two people come together, to me, they're sparking life. By, let's just say, if there's a baby that's being being created, right? There's life being created in that moment, right, by the union of two people. And so that miracle of life is an energy that I can only speak to personally, that I have specifically feel in breath work, right? So, and in yoga, because I teach Kundalini yoga as well. But it's an experience of an energy that's something greater than myself. And so, over the 20 years that I've been facilitating breath work, like literally last year, for the first time, this came clear to me that I've experienced viscerally, that I witness in clients, is that essentially we are conduits for life, love, and spirit to flow through us. Now, if we haven't ever experienced that, viscerally, it's just a concept. But I have experienced this viscerally many, many times through breath work, and again, witnessed it in others, where there's just the sense of, through the breathing, that there is something greater. And every religion around the world talks about this mysterious connection between breath and spirit. So, my
Mm.
invitation is, if that isn't something that somebody understands, is to get into breath work, because undoubtedly at some point we can feel that. But we are open beings when we're very young, right? Open and authentically expressive, but through conditioning we learn to contract, defend, and really not allow ourselves to be open and to feel that energy moving through us. So that's life force. What are we on to next? I
Tick.
forget. Yeah.
Okay, so how is the energy of pleasure, sensuality, and sexuality related to creativity, like our creative energy? What is the relationship between that?
Well, I mean, the way I see it, everything is energy, right? Everything is energy. And if we're shut down, and if we're barely allowing energy to flow throughout our bodies, or, then of course we're going to shut down creativity. We're going to shut down, and, we're going to constrict our ability to receive information through the senses, therefore pleasure. Right. And we're going to restrict our sexuality. And in part, that's conditioning specifically around sexuality, where we just really like get stuck in the hips and contracted in that area, right? Because there's so much taboo around that, and so much shame as a result of the taboo. And we may even have even more shame due from experiences we've had in our lifetime, but just even if we grew up without it being talked about. So creativity is, again, simply energy, and there really, to me, isn't a whole lot of difference. But I'll tell you this, that um when I was doing breath work on writing retreats around the country for a year and a half. I was working with a facilitator who was very clever, because he experienced breath work with me and said, I need you to come along to all of my writing retreats. And so basically, we would start the day off with the breath work, but I would kind of shorten them to what I normally do as a ceremony. But we'd start off with a half hour of breath work, and then we'd have different breath work breaks, right? Where I'd have up to 50 people coming in and lying down and doing the breath work for maybe 20 minutes to 30 minutes throughout the day. And I'll tell you what, Hannah, they wouldn't just get up off the mat and go back to their desks to continue writing. They would sometimes sprint because it would unlock their
Mm,
creativity. All of a sudden, plot lines would come in, or, just ideas for the book, names, so on and so forth, details, right? And just this, but they would feel it viscerally as well. And then anytime that somebody had a block, they would just come and see me privately, and I would get them to move their bodies and open up their throat. So we'd make some sound and get their breath flowing. And almost invariably, what would happen is that the block was emotional. And the
mm,
minute they started to open up and let the emotions out, boom, all of a sudden, there they were, and they were ready to write again.
mm. Yeah, wow. Thank
And
you.
so you probably, are familiar with this too, Hannah, but a lot of breath workers have people at the end of a breath work draw a mandala or, do something expressive like that, right?
Mm.
Because it is an opening to our creativity.
Okay, so last question for this conversation. I hope you'll come back and have many more with me.
Aw, thank you. I'd
Um,
love to.
this word has popped up a little bit, and it's shame. Yeah, it's this word of shame. Could you talk to me a little bit about, yeah, sensuality, sexuality, shame? Sort of where and how is shame popping up in this topic, and how does it prevent us from feeling strong in our sexuality and really claiming our pleasure?
Yeah, well, that's such a great question, Hannah. Everybody has it, as far as I can tell. And it is really, at the end of the day, all about the conditioning and imprinting. So, anytime that we have secrecy, which essentially is anything that's not talked about, right? But that's obviously happening, like sex, right? Um, then there's shame. So, one of the things that can be the most helpful is just to open up conversation, because shame breeds in secrecy. Then the more, we feel like we have to keep something secret, then the more shame builds. And, I mean, even just emotionally, like whether regardless of sexuality, but I mean, I'm just, this is in terms of like relationship. I've been learning that to really speak to my partner about my inner child stuff, just because I realized I had a lot of shame about my inner child behaviors, when my inner child would act up. So
Mm,
um, so just to kind of clear the shame for myself was just to actually like put it on the table. But so, with regard to sexuality, it's like, gosh, I mean, the religious influence in that, I mean, and the puritanical and, so on and so forth. It's just so pervasive, and so, the disconnect between bodies, that, there is this, prevailing attitude towards our bodies that they shouldn't be experiencing pleasure, right? Or that we shouldn't be having sex, or only under certain conditions. So this compartmentalization that is
mm,
so deeply ingrained in our culture, to disconnect from the body, disconnect from pleasure, disconnect from sexuality. I mean, not just are we pleasurable beings or pleasure seeking beings, but at a young age, our erotic self is developing, right? And that's very often taught out of us, but with a lot of shame, a lot of scolding, a lot of punishment, right? Not really a lot of understanding that a child touching themselves is normal, right? And maybe can be, guided into doing it at certain times, but more often than not, child, just taking delight in their body in whatever way that looks like is shamed, right? So it can be in our own experience, but it's just deeply, deeply ingrained in the culture, and is through osmosis at the end of the day. So the more that we can learn about ourselves, and the more that we can talk about, all of these things, about pleasure, about sensuality, and open up those conversations with anybody who will listen, who, using discernment, um, is the way to dispel shame, right? And it is a growing field, this is a growing field. This, sexuality is a growing field. I'm really, really happy to say. So, and I'm really happy to be a part of that growing field. So, even that just in and of itself, if somebody feels a lot of shame, finding somebody like myself, somebody who they can first start to, talk about things and realize, that probably everything they're feeling and experiencing is normal, right? So
Mm.
normalizing for people, because people are just thinking like, oh, I'm a freak, and not realizing that everything that they're thinking about or feeling is within the spectrum of normal.
Yeah, thank you. It's impossible to have one conversation about this.
It's
So
just scratching the surface,
it's
truly. Yeah.
really scratching the surface. And yeah, thank you for your time today. And thank you also for being part of creating this counterculture, because conditioning seems to be such a strong suppressive ingredient around how we're having to like navigate ourselves into a more freer um, existence. And yeah, thank you
Mm,
for being
mm,
part of that wave of change, because it's time that
my
that
pleasure, no pun
change came.
intended. Yeah, that's
And
exciting.
just to finish, is there anything that you want to say to anybody listening? Know that I will put all your links to your workshops and the
Mm.
Breath is Prayer in the description. But yeah, do you have a closing message that you want to share?
Just this concept of playing, just has really been something that has come up for me in particular this weekend. So I just want to leave on that note to remember to incorporate play, because honestly, I found myself last week just kind of questioning, what is play for me, right? And to know that shifts and evolves, right? So again, just reminding yourself of what was play when you were a child, and maybe finding some of those common threads in your life today, and to be willing to explore what play is, and to know that maybe for a while it'll look like this, and maybe for a while it'll look like that, right? And that often play does involve pleasure, right? And that the more that we can allow ourselves to play, it's not luxury at all. It's a necessity, right? Look at animals, look at children. This is how they learn. This is how we learn. This is how we get to experience um, oxytocin, right? And we could all use some more of that, especially right now.
Yeah, they're happy hormones.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
bring them in.
Yeah.
Or create them. Actually, don't bring them in, they're actually in us already.
That's
We
right.
have the
Yeah.
ability to just create more. So yeah, okay, well, much love always.
Much love
And
to you. Thank you
yeah,
so much.
we'll talk again soon. Thank you, Gwen.
That sounds great. Bye.
Bye.